New York Congresswoman Kathleen Rice, also the chairwoman of the Committee on Homeland Security's Border Security, will lead a trip along the southern border starting today. The visit follows DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen's visit to El Paso border facilities yesterday. Now, this trip does include a stop to El Paso. According to DHS, Nielsen met with frontline operators to assess the department's response to the increase in migrant crossings. She also reviewed the measures announced earlier this week to reassign CBP agents to help Border Patrol process the large number of migrants arriving every day.
Secretary Nielsen has taken the step of redeploying resources, moving them from the ports of entry to the areas where there are the surge of illegal immigrants coming through the border, and also working closely with Mexico so that we put into place the migration mitigation protocol.
Chairwoman Rice's visit to the border also includes stops in McAllen and Brownsville.
President Donald Trump is touring the border. He was in Calexico, California today. ABC 7 reporter Julio Cesar Chavez explains what the president and some members of Congress are saying following their visit.
Stella, we are next to the Bridge of the Americas right now, where a group of congressional representatives is speaking to the press right now about what they saw on their trip today. This group of congressional representatives includes our very own Veronica Escobar and Representative Kathleen Rice, Border Security Subcommittee Chair. They toured the El Paso sector. They went to two bridges, the downtown and the Bridge of the Americas, along with Border Patrol Station, where migrants are being detained before their release. And at the same time, President Trump was in Calexico. He was given a tour of parts of the border fence that was just renovated. Trump told the migrants directly not to come to the U.S. and threatened Mexico's economy with sanctions if the crossings did not die down. He also pushed for more wall.
We expect to have close to 400 miles done within about 2 years from now. That's a lot. 400 miles will cover most of it.
Now, again, the congressional representatives who toured the border here in El Paso are speaking to the media right now. We'll get right back to that press conference in a bit, but so far what they have said is that they don't see money that they have allocated for humanitarian aid and for the handling of the migrant crisis used properly by Homeland Security. We're going to ask them in just a couple of seconds, or rather just a couple of minutes, what it is that they propose to be done, or if any bills are being put onto debate for this issue. Reporting next to the Bridge of the Americas, Julio Cesar Chavez, ABC 7.
Okay, Julio Cesar, thank you, and we'll see you again at 10. We will hear more from the visiting congressional delegation tonight at 10, and also go to our website for more coverage of border issues, including fact checks on President Trump, tariffs on Mexico, and the border wall.
New at 10, members of Congress from across the nation toured our border today, led by El Paso Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. The group met with the director of the Annunciation House, the ACLU, and officials with CBP and ICE. Escobar says trade and legal crossings are being affected as a result of the Trump administration's move to pull CBP agents from their duties and instead having them do social services work. Another congresswoman says the buck stops with Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen.
What she has failed to do in terms of taking the money that Congress, that we, Democrats and Republicans, have appropriated to the Department of Homeland Security, not just to help the humanitarian crisis here at the border, but to enable her to hire additional CBP officers, to get more resources here so we can address this issue that was created by this failed policy. And what I saw today was none of that money that we appropriated being used to address this crisis.
Congresswoman Escobar says another group of lawmakers will tour the border next week.
KFOX 14 News at 9's Keenan Willer joins us live from the newsroom about their visit.
Well, 5 congresswomen from across the country joined together in south central El Paso today to talk about their touring CBP facilities in the borderland. And their takeaway, we're facing a humanitarian crisis, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse.
The congresswomen gathered at St. Francis Xavier Church in the shadow of the packed Bridge of the Americas. 4 of them from the House's Border Security Subcommittee, all hosted by El Paso Representative Veronica Escobar. They're here to evaluate the situation here on the border and bring their findings back to Washington. And those findings were significant.
What I saw today was nothing more, nothing less than a humanitarian crisis.
The representatives described touring Customs and Border Patrol facilities where migrants are being held and being horrified at the results.
Mothers crying mobbing us, crying, saying, help us, we can't sleep here.
Among their concerns about CBP facilities, migrants having their clothes taken from them upon arrival, sleeping on the floors, and not being able to bathe for days at a time. Congresswoman Escobar says these humanitarian issues are symptoms of a larger staffing issue for the Border Patrol organization.
Our agents are completely overwhelmed. They have not been given the resources or the leadership, frankly, from Secretary Nielsen in order to really address what's happening here.
The representatives say solving the crisis will take both increases in the number of Border Patrol agents and increased economic support for Central American countries. They say that type of help will alleviate strain on border communities like El Paso.
And El Pasoans have been incredibly generous, and I am very proud of the community, but you're right, the federal government needs to fix this.
Congresswoman Veronica Escobar said that she's working to introduce legislation that would reimburse local governments for the money that they spend fighting the humanitarian crisis at the border. From the newsroom, Keenan Willard, KFOX 14 News at 9.
While the president was touring the border in California, a delegation of Democrat congressional representatives visited El Paso as part of their own tour of the border. Several members of Congress, including El Paso's Representative Veronica Escobar and Representative Kathleen Rice, the Border Security Subcommittee Chair, toured the El Paso sector. They saw two international bridges, one downtown and the Bridge of the Americas in central El Paso. They also toured a Border Patrol station where migrants are detained before their release.
Agents are being pulled off of duties that should be contracted out to social service agencies or given to FEMA or given to folks who are better trained, better equipped. And that recommendation should have always come direct from the top, from Secretary Nielsen, but instead we've seen policies implemented that have made a challenge far worse.
Democratic congresswomen are detailing the issues they believe are plaguing the U.S.-Mexico border. CBS 4's Keenan Willard joins us live from the newsroom with where they believe funding is needed.
Well, 5 congresswomen from across the country gave a press conference at the border today after touring CBP facilities, and they described experiencing what they called a humanitarian crisis at the border. The representatives believe it's different from the crisis President Trump used to declare a national emergency. Among the issues they saw were migrants having their clothes taken from them upon arriving at the border, sleeping on hard floors, and not being allowed to bathe for days at a time. They also said that recent counts that show 15% of El Paso Border Patrol agents being pulled from the border to focus on humanitarian aid as contributing to the crisis. Now, in terms of potential solutions for the crisis, the representatives cited increasing the number of Border Patrol boots on the ground, as well as providing increased aid to Central American countries. From the newsroom, Keenan Willard, CBS 4 News at 10.
Several members of Congress spoke in El Paso yesterday. They spoke to address concerns over border security. That story for you now.
The congresswoman gathered at St. Francis Xavier Church in the shadow of the packed Bridge of the Americas. 4 of them from the House's Border Security Subcommittee, all hosted by El Paso Representative Veronica Escobar. They're here to evaluate the situation here on the border and bring their findings back to Washington. And those findings were significant.
What I saw today was nothing more, nothing less than a humanitarian crisis.
The representatives described touring Customs and Border Patrol facilities where migrants are being held and being horrified at the results.
Mothers crying, mobbing us, crying, saying, help us, we can't sleep here.
Among their concerns about CBP facilities, migrants having their clothes taken from them upon arrival, sleeping on the floors, and not being able to bathe for days at a time. Congresswoman Escobar says these humanitarian issues are symptoms of a larger staffing issue for the Border Patrol organization.
Our agents are completely overwhelmed. They have not been given the resources or the leadership, frankly, from Secretary Nielsen in order to really address what's happening here.
The representatives say solving the crisis will take both increases in the number of Border Patrol agents and increased economic support for Central American countries. They say that type of help will alleviate strain on border communities like El Paso.
And El Pasoans have been incredibly generous, and I'm very proud of the community, but you're right, the federal government needs to fix this.
Meanwhile, Garden City Congresswoman Kathleen Rice holding a press conference in El Paso yesterday after touring the border.
But what I saw today was nothing more, nothing less than a humanitarian crisis that has been created by a policy this administration put into place when they decided to separate families here at the border without any plan of how they were going to address the needs of those people.
Rice, one of 5 Democratic congresswomen who toured the Customs and Border Patrol facilities where migrants were being held.
Get perspective now from a member of the House Committee on Homeland Security. I spoke with New York Democratic Congresswoman Kathleen Rice just earlier tonight. Congresswoman Rice, I'm wondering what you make of the president's desire to not only reinstate his child separation policy, but also apparently to expand it.
So, Anderson, I am just appalled by what the president is talking about. I just literally got back this morning after spending the weekend in El Paso and McAllen, Texas. So I was at the Bridge of the Americas, where all those people were held under the bridge. I saw the processing of families, of migrants coming here for a safer life. We went to the ICE detention facility where all of the women and children are. It is horrifying. That's what's still happening at the border. I mean, they still cannot figure out a way to connect parents with the children that they pull them away from. So when I hear the president talk about reinstituting this family separation policy, that, by the way, let's be clear, is the sole reason that there is any chaos at the border right now. We spoke to Border Patrol agents and we said to them, what is the one thing that you need now to do your jobs more than anything? And you know what they said? They said, people. We need more Border Patrol agents.
In terms of the president ordering Pompeo and then Secretary Nielsen to shut the port of El Paso, it's certainly within his legal right to shut down a border crossing if he chooses.
Well, yes, he could. But, you know, thankfully, the saner people, there are still some, I believe, in the administration, convinced him that that would be an economic disaster. We met with business leaders down at the port where $1.7 billion worth of trade goes over the Mexican-United States border every single day, Anderson. So this was going to have an economic impact that was going to hit this country in a very real way. And I'm glad that people in his administration actually talked him out of that. But I got to say, you know, look, Trump owns his immigration policy, but there are a lot of people talking about how Kirstjen Nielsen was pushed out by Stephen Miller and that Stephen Miller is the true architect of this administration's immigration policy. So I've got a proposal. How about Stephen Miller ask the president to appoint him as the Secretary of DHS so he can be upfront and he can come to the committees on the Senate and the House side and answer questions about these policies that he is pushing single-handedly. Let him explain to the American people why he wants to go back to ripping babies out of their mother's arms. Own it. He should own the policy that he is pushing, that he's the architect of.
You'd been calling for Nielsen to resign, I think, for more than a year now. Now that she has, I wonder, do you have any concerns that she may have been one of the few left in the administration to at least try and curb some of the president's worst ideas?
You know, I think in the beginning she tried to, but I think pretty quickly, because she wanted to remain part of the team and she wanted to run the agency, she very quickly did what a lot of other people in the administration do and just adopted, you know, full throttle every position that the president took, no matter how wrong-headed it was.
It's kind of nuts when you think she was down in Central America signing an agreement. I think it was on a Wednesday. They announced it on a Thursday with, you know, much fanfare in a press release. And the next day, the president totally undercuts that, which was a, you know, just about everybody on the immigration battle who you talk to say, look, more needs to be done on the front lines in Guatemala, in Honduras, and El Salvador to stop people before they leave.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme, Anderson, in this president's administration. He says one thing one day and one thing another. I think Nielsen was right to go down to the Northern Triangle countries and work out a deal. Look, this is what foreign aid is all about. This is why Congress appropriates that money. It's a foreign policy a philosophy that says we're going to give you money to allow you to build an infrastructure in your own country that will give your people the ability to live a wonderful life in their own home and not make them feel like they have to flee across thousands and thousands of miles so that they can raise their children in safety.
Congresswoman Rice, appreciate your time.
The southern border, of course, remaining a major focus for the Trump administration. Well, 5 Democratic Congress members went down to El Paso for a firsthand look at the conditions there. And joining me now is one of them, California Representative Nanette Barragan. She is on the Homeland Security Committee, also is the second vice chair on the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Congresswoman, I'm very glad to get your bird's eye view on all of this. I want your biggest takeaways from that visit, and starting with the most alarming things that you saw.
The most alarming was that we're still treating people inhumanely. These are human beings, these migrants that are fleeing violence in their country. I wanted to particularly see where the bridge of that photo where the families were being held. I wanted to see that area, and I wanted to ask questions on where those families are now. What we learned was alarming. They frankly have just been moved to another area.
Right.
And that is just heartbreaking, what I saw in those tents. They have 3 tents now instead of 1. And we had families, women and children mobbing us, asking for help, crying. One woman in particular had a child, 4 months old, 5 months old, in these tents in the outdoors. It is unbelievable. They have the same clothes on for 5 days. They're filthy. Mom was saying she got 1 pamper a day, even though the officer said they could ask for more than that. It was absolutely heartbreaking to see that these people have been moved. Some of them have been released, but I talked to women and children who have still been in detention since that time.
You have called this a humanitarian crisis, and by that description, I don't think anyone can disagree with that. Is there any way to curb it, any way to limit what you're seeing there?
Well, you know, Congress passed about $415 million of humanitarian aid in February, and I'm not sure that money is getting down there yet. And Secretary Nielsen is coming before our committee on May 1st on the budget. We're going to ask those tough questions, but we need to make sure that we find places, if necessary, that are indoors. I mean, when I say if necessary, if there's an overflow, if they're having a lot of people, we've got to find places where we can have them indoors. It's really inhumane to have them outdoors, under these tents, under these conditions, being fed what they're being fed. They're bound to get sick. They're bound to then spread diseases because they're so close together. You can hardly walk. People don't have a lot of space. And just being in that tent for 5 minutes, I myself got nauseous and asked if the secretary has the opportunity to see this. And, you know, Secret Service won't let her inside. So she's not even seeing what I'm seeing. And it's really heartbreaking. The American people should be outraged, as I am.
I remember even last summer with the soaring heat there in Arizona and Texas and people being kept in camps. So we had those issues. So you're right. They need to have structures in which they can stay at least for a short period of time. The president in Las Vegas yesterday, let's take a listen to him demanding cutting aid to El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras. Here it is.
I've taken a lot of heat from the stupid people that say, oh, gee, we should keep. We have people that work with them that say we should be sending much more money. We should be building things there, helping them. What about building our own country for a change? Wouldn't that be nice?
You know, Congressman, I know that you are one of the people who says we should be investing in this country. So it may be prideful for you to hear the president called you one of the stupid people, essentially, and you're like, yeah, no, I know what I'm doing is right. Your reaction to this message from the president is what?
Well, I think he's wrong. And if you talk to people that have been working the border, that have been working in the Northern Triangle, even people like John Kelly, Jay Johnson, they will tell you, especially Jay Johnson will tell you that when there was an influx of migrants coming in the past, it was looking to work with our partners, working with these countries, investing in them, helping the situation. We have to remember why people are fleeing. It's because in their own country, the conditions that are happening, the gang violence, one of their members was killed. those country conditions, if they improved, I think we would see the influx of people reduce. And that, I think, should be our goal, is making sure we continue the partnerships and making sure that we help the situation in that way. Cutting aid is only going to make the problem worse. And I know the Congress has put out a resolution last week that we'll be voting on, basically to condemn the president, making sure that money that Congress has allocated is actually used for these areas.
What else are you going to ask Secretary Nielsen on May 1st when she appears for you?
Well, I'm going to ask her about the conditions of these migrants for sure, make sure that she knows what's going on. Sometimes I kind of wonder on what she knows. And I'm going to ask her about the budget, certainly where the money is going that Congress has been allocated situation. And frankly, there's been a slowdown in the immigration process, and it feels to me as though it's intentional. The president loves to inflict pain as a deterrent. He's doing it with families. He did it with the separation policy, and we just have to continue to ask the tough questions so the American people know, and we hold them accountable and try to stop the treatment of migrants.
California Representative Nanette Barragan, thank you so much for joining me.
As well as to Homeland Security. We're joined now by a special guest, Congresswoman Nanette Diaz-Barragan, who joins us. She's a member of the Homeland Security Committee and a representative Democrat from California. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. What do you make of the fallout now? What do you make of the fallout now from the president's decision to fire Secretary Nielsen?
Well, it was long overdue. It was time for her to go. I've been calling for her to resign since last June after she was misleading the public about the separation of families. But here's the reality, is there's chaos in the Department of Homeland Security. There's nobody really in charge there. The number one person is now gone. The number 3 person left. Vitello got pulled. We don't know who's in charge, frankly. It's disorganized, and you can see that happening at the border. I was just in El Paso this weekend to see firsthand the accounts of the way our migrants are being treated, and it's completely inhumane.
So in terms of the reporting from our colleagues as well as from other outlets with the ascent of Stephen Miller to having a more prominent voice on the issue of immigration within the administration, what does that mean from your committee's vantage point in terms of more oversight over DHS?
Well, it's deeply alarming and concerning that this president and Stephen Miller want to be tougher on immigration and tougher at the border. We're going to have serious oversight and continue it probably more closely than ever, especially when you hear reports of the president and the administration wanting to go back to zero tolerance policy, wanting to go back to the separation, and whether Stephen Miller is behind that is pretty outrageous. But the American people need to do what they did last time, and that is be outraged, speak up, so that we can make sure that it is not happening again and these policies are not reinstated. I can assure you that the chairman of our committee will be on top of this administration to make sure that we know what is happening and how they're implementing policy. And frankly, we need to look at funding opportunities where if we need to put in restrictions so they treat people humanely and not doing what they want to do again, which is separating families. You know, we should look at those options as well.
Congresswoman Barragan, I was wondering, what are you hearing from your home state in California, which is so dependent on agriculture and migrant workers? Are they having a real issue with the administration's immigration policy?
I think a lot of people are having real issues with this administration's policy. Certainly, my congressional district is heavily impacted by the administration's immigration policies. I have a district that's 70% Latino. When you go down to the south border, we certainly see agricultural workers down there and the conditions that they face. And we are hearing from folks about the impacts this is going to have overall on the workforce in California. But that's something I'd have to talk to more to my colleague Juan Vargas about, who represents the southern border down in San Diego. And,
you know, besides basically trying to make sure this doesn't happen again, is there anything that you think the administration can and should do immediately to relieve what's happening on the border?
Well, I think the first thing they immediately need to do is to get humanitarian aid that Congress allocated in February. We gave $415 million for humanitarian relief at the border. That money needs to immediately get there so they can use that dollars to treat people right. I mean, it's unconscionable what's happening there. You got 4-month, 5-month-old children sleeping under the elements outside in the cold. With the same clothes for 5 days, and they're dirty, they're bound to get sick. It's not healthy. So we need to immediately address that issue. Second, we need to look at other options to detention. This has been something the prior administration had done. This current administration would love to get rid of Flores. It would love to hold children indefinitely with family units. We know that. We heard some of the White House advisors talk about that. We also heard it straight from CBP at the border this weekend. They want to do away with this decision, which was actually put in place to protect children and to not have them detained indefinitely because of the trauma it causes them.
Congresswoman, from an economic standpoint, the president last week threatening to raise tariffs on 25% of autos coming from Mexico should they not get to the negotiating table in terms of taking a more hardline approach, the administration argues, on the issue of immigration. But from an economic standpoint, $1.7 billion in commerce daily crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. What would the economic impacts be to the U.S. economy should the president raise tariffs or shut down ports of entry or stops along the border?
Well, it would be a disaster. That's the short way to put it. Because of the trade that we do with Mexico, shutting down that border would be a disaster, not to just the American economy, to American workers. This weekend in Texas, we actually spoke to business officials and business owners who are both on the Mexico side and the U.S. side, talking about the long lines and the slowdown that's happening right now with the ports of entry and how that could cause plants to shut down on both sides. It's unbelievable and unreal that the president would want to inflict economic damage on this country and on American businesses. So we really urge him to reconsider that option, and businesses along the border are doing the same thing.
Okay, thanks to Congresswoman Nanette Diaz-Barragan, Democrat.